There are splitting views in the design profession on the role of architects in the perpetuation and even existence of prisons. This stems from an ethical and professional belief that incarceration is not the most optimum solution to crime, and that the very design of prisons creates conditions that subject the inmates to inhuman living conditions. It also draws attention to the larger question of punishment and how architecture becomes a tool for discipline. While in the previous episode we focused on an alternate method of seeking justice, for this one I wanted to look at what is happening in the world of prison reforms. Our guest today, Pia Puolakka, trained as a forensic psychologist and has been working as a prison psychologist for the Criminal Sanctions Agency in Finland. In 2018, she was appointed as a project manager of the Smart Prison Project, where she developed digital services for inmate rehabilitation. I am Vaishnavi Shukla, and this is Architecture of Center, a podcast where we highlight unconventional design perspectives, practices, and research projects that reflect emerging discourses within the design discipline and beyond. Architecture of Center features conversations with radical designers, thinkers, and changemakers who are redefining the way we live and interact with the built environment. Are we all set?
I think so. Yes.
Okay then, Pia. I am very intrigued by your background and your career path. You are neither a designer nor a policymaker. In fact, you are a forensic psychologist, and in fact, the first forensic psychologist on the podcast. Can you walk us through your journey? How did you end up at the Criminal Center Agency, and what led you to the Smart Prison Project?
I started as a prison psychologist, and I was working for almost 10 years as a prison psychologist before I came to the Central Administration Unit where I work now. And there was an open position for senior specialist in rehabilitative practices. And since I was a forensic psychologist and I had been doing rehabilitative work in prisons for such a long time, I was appointed. And then when I had been working for 1 year in that position, this Smart Prison Project was opened, and they were looking for somebody, maybe not so technically oriented person, but someone who could combine digital services and rehabilitative practices, and who could understand the new prison concept, which was for us prison as a learning environment. And this technical side was something that I've been learning by doing all the time. So I've had some further studies then after I started in this digitalisation project. But I think it was the idea of Criminal Sanctions Agency to have someone who could think about not only the technical side, but the idea that we are providing new services to prisoners for rehabilitative purposes, for reintegration purposes, and also to teach them digital skills, which are part of the life outside of prison. And often prisoners lack these kind of skills. And it's one reason for marginalization, that you cannot take care of your daily affairs in a modern society, which is all the time more and more digitalized, and all vocational careers, all vocational and high school studies are based on having enough digital skills. Follow these kind of educations and apply for job, for example. So I think that's why I got involved, and that's why I was appointed for this position as a forensic psychologist.
So for those who are not familiar with the Smart Prison Project, do you want to walk us through what the project is and what you have been doing so far?
Before the Smart Prison project started, we had already started building a new women's prison, a prison for 100 women prisoners, and it was supposed to be based on this new prison concept. And then Criminal Sanctions Agency knew that there are already some smart prisons in other countries in Europe. And we kind of wanted to adopt this model to Finland too and start the digitalisation development in Finnish prisons too. And the idea in the smart prison is that every prisoner has a personal cell device. So the device is directly in the cell, and you can use services inside prison, online, and in a restricted way also to outside.
But this cell device is not a mobile phone, is it? Or is it like a tab, or is it a completely new device that you have designed?
In the Finnish smart prison, it's a laptop.
Okay, understood.
So they are using the laptop, and that was the model they preferred, since it's easier, for example, to write with the laptop model compared to tablets. But I know that in some prisons they also have tablets and also these kind of joint use workstations, a kind of kiosk models. But in our case, we have laptops in all of the 100 cells of the new women's prison. So everybody has their personal device directly in the cell. So this was kind of the first aim of the project. And then on the other hand, the idea was that at the same time we take care of the development in all our units, not necessarily providing personal devices, but developing the digital services on the so-called joint use workstations that we already had in all our prisons and probation offices. So we've been developing this system too and providing new services to offenders.
Can you give us an example of these digital services?
So, for example, a lot of our partners outside, NGOs and other officials and organizations that arrange rehabilitative practices for prisoners can contact online our prisons and offenders and provide their services online. And also educational courses can be done on the joint use devices. Various social services can be used on the devices. So basically there's a selection of relevant websites that prisoners can browse through and search for suitable services. There's also websites for substance abuse, rehabilitation, for healthcare, for psychological, social, family and children's issues, and services like this. And then we have some special pilots that we only use in certain units to kind of test new practices, like our virtual reality pilot.
Really?
What we have in 3 prisons, yes.
That's fancy.
Yeah, it is. We use VR environments for rehabilitative purposes in a kind of a test environment. And then we also have some NGOs who can provide us digital skills courses in some units. This is what we do.
This is kind of path-breaking. It's a new, absolutely new way to think about technology, and especially virtual reality is pretty fun. I mean, I haven't had enough exposure with virtual reality, but to take a technology like that and make it accessible in a place like a prison is, I would say, quite radical and very interesting. The Smart Prison Project, as you said, aims at integrating digital services and technology within the prison infrastructure, with the goal to enable prison occupants to stay abreast of developments in the society outside. I think you also mentioned that technology often becomes a way to marginalize prisoners, and that the lack of these digital services further separates them from the civil society. Now, I find this idea to be very profound, especially as I'm reading. A lot of architectural listeners will have heard this name a lot. I'm reading Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish at the moment. And Foucault traces the emergence of prisons as building types created specifically to punish those who have committed a crime. There's also a separate discourse on the idea of a panopticon and the role of surveillance in a prisons. And then way back in the day, there's artists like Piranesi who've portrayed a very surreal depiction of prisons. So in his collection of drawings called, if I'm not pronouncing it wrong, Carceri de Invenzione, or Imaginary Prisons, Piranesi depicts the dark and foreboding nature of prison architecture. Whereas the Smart Prison Project radically challenges all these notions of what a prison should be and aims to, if I can use the word, rehabilitate prisoners for a better life after serving their sentence. How do you think the Smart Prison Project challenges the idea of punishment in prisons, or for that matter, even pushes the architectural design of these prisons in an entirely new direction? So I was just thinking about how in history, when we look at a lot of literature and a lot of these theories, when you think about a prison or the way a prison was designed or created, was directly related to the idea of punishment. But when you're looking at the Smart Prison Project, it seems like the element of punishment has somewhere been in negotiation with the idea of freedom. So when you bring technology into prisons, you're almost allowing a certain degree of freedom to these prisoners, or a certain kind of liberty or exposure. And that stands directly opposite to what punishment is supposed to be, because you're increasing their access to information. You're trying to have, all these skill development workshops. You've tied up with NGOs. So you're actually trying to not look at it as a way to punish people, but also mindful at the same time that they're there in the prison because of something that they have done wrong in the past. So with that in mind, what do you think is the role of punishment when you're looking at the Smart Prison Project? Because one of the videos that we look at your work in the Smart Prison Project, there's also an element of how prisoners are allowed to move around freely, maybe even step out of the prison for a while and then, step back in. What are your thoughts on the punishment aspect of it?
So the only punishment that prison is supposed to be is that you lose your freedom for a limited period of time. And in the Finnish system, there are different levels of losing this freedom. So we also have the so-called high security units and closed prisons, where prisoners go first, especially if they have a long sentence. But it's the idea that towards the end of your sentence, you step by step become more accustomed again of how life is outside. And this is to actually take this, the idea is that doing it in this way will make prisoners easier to reintegrate, because total exclusion produces a high risk for reoffending. If you get free without learning how to reintegrate back, this becoming free of prison comes a risk in itself, which is not what it's supposed to be, because then the system has failed if it heightens people's risk instead of lowering it.
Yeah.
So there must be a balance between the punishment side, which is inevitable since it's a prison sentence, and the rehabilitative side, which anyway provides prisoners services during their prison sentence in order to have an effect on their risk levels, recidivism, and in order to reintegrate them back to the society. Because that's the idea of how to succeed with the system. And we probably know that this doesn't always succeed. But if we can make it more successful with these kind of changes, like providing more services during the prison time also from outside prison, when this digital means become important. There are a lot of services in the outside society that prisoners would probably need or benefit during their prison time, but they cannot use them since they are in prison. And all these service providers cannot come inside the prison. So actually the online digital way of using services is the only possibility in some cases. So I think this is a way to lessen the risk of offenders. I don't see it as contradictory to the idea of punishment, and I wouldn't prefer to speak about punishment and rehabilitations as opposites.
Right.
In a way that it's often done. Both of these elements are part of the prison sentence inevitably. But there's no need to be more punishment than the loss of your freedom, because we know that giving more punishment, longer sentences, or not so humane treatment during prison time doesn't make things better for anyone. Not for the offenders, but not for the outside society either, or let alone the victims of these offenders. So nobody benefits from more harsh practices.
As we continue speaking to Pia, let's take a little break and see what's lined up for our next episode with architectural historian Robert Jan van Pelt, who served as a defense expert witness in a court case concerning the Auschwitz concentration camp.
The fact that we're dealing with a building complex that was the site of a enormous crime against humanity that was prosecuted in various courts means also that you have an unusual kind of supply of material from the judicial system. Very important is the interrogation of a clerk in the Gestapo office. And then we have the prosecution of the architects of Auschwitz, two of the architects in Vienna in 1970. So that already creates kind of an unusual body of material that you're dealing with.
This is going to be a 2-part episode you don't want to miss. So tune in 2 weeks from now to hear more about how an architectural historian ended up testifying in court. Now, I know you piloted the Smart Prison project with a new women's prison that you just built, and you were testing the program. And in our earlier conversation, we had very briefly spoken about how the digital services were integrated within the building. And now my architecture brain is very curious to know, as a psychologist, what did you think in terms of design of that building? How do you think that was different than the existing prisons, the way it was designed and built, because it was going to be part of the Smart Prison project? I don't know, simple things like a lot of student projects which deal with the design of prisons would usually look at better ventilation, good sunlight, cell sizes, just common gathering spaces, a little interaction with a good landscape. Because a lot of times when you, in the movies and, well, even in real life, you see prisons, they're supposed to be these cold, harsh places. But I know that the prison you design and build does not look anything like that. What do you think changed in the design of the prisons with the integration of the Smart Prison project?
Yes, I think there's more open areas inside of the prison, and the colors and lighting, as you said, are taken into consideration. And there's also green areas around the prison where prisoners can spend their time. So small things are important. If I'm thinking about the structure of the prison, of course, where do you see that it's a prison is basically that the doors are closed. This is one thing. And that the staff is in prison officers' suits, and the doors of cells are also kept locked for some parts of the day and during night. But otherwise, the idea must have been to look for a concept, as I said, prison as a learning environment, that it would more remind you of some kind of a school or intern environment, or some kind of a rehabilitative center, not necessarily a hospital, but some kind of a rehab center, for example. So of course, since it anyway must be done a secure unit where it's difficult to flee, you have to think of some things differently than when building another kind of rehabilitative center. But as far as you can take into consideration the materials and the colors, and also kind of that there's more open space in the premises that are not for individual use of a prisoner, but where prisoners can spend their joint time during the day. So, for example, these are important things.
We do see a lot of prison reform movements popping up across the world, but there are also a lot of complexities involved with it, right? I think you mentioned earlier there are also some high security prisons. If you think about it in terms of quality of life, for example, in a country like Finland, which has been voted as the happiest country in the world for the past 4 years, one would assume that the nature of crimes is different than, say, a country like India, where I'm from, or that the overall relationship of the country with its criminal justice system is different. Maybe it's even a lot more positive in its outlook. How do you imagine the smart prison movement growing and adapting internationally, were it to take form in different parts of the world?
I think this kind of model can be applied to prisons. But of course, you have to remember that we have different kind of prisoners. So this is also one stereotype, that when we think of a prisoner, we think a specific type of person. And the reality is that these people are very varied individuals, as all of us. Of course, there are similarities too, and there are common risk factors that lead to prison. But yes, there probably might be units where you need to take the security issues more into consideration, and then units where prisoners can be in more open premises. But I wouldn't see, not necessarily would I see that providing digital services would be somehow the biggest risk. I think the risks in the highest security units are something else. The major risk is not that the prisoner can use restricted internet, but the risks are totally something else. So seeing digitalization as some kind of a risk I think it might be a bit of an exaggerated idea that it would be such a risk. Nowadays, all these data security, data protection issues are very important. But as we did in Finland, it's possible with today's technology to build secure systems, even for prisons where special things has to be taken into consideration. But it is possible to build systems like this, and there are already vendors in Europe who are specialized in prison technology, and I don't only mean security technique, but these prisoner cell device systems, kind of a self-service systems, as some vendors call it. So I would see that it's inevitable that in the same way as all our institutions in society are developing and getting digitalized, the same thing is going to happen in prisons too. Because of the special nature of prisons, prison systems tend to lag behind the development of the rest of the society.
Yeah.
In many questions, and it's understandable. Regarding this digitalization, it was the same thing in Finland, that compared to other systems of the society, like schools or hospitals, they were already digitalized for years before prisoners got the same kind of devices as clients in other organizations and institutions of society are already using. So I think this development will definitely continue. It's just a question of time.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait for it to see and, evolve and travel all the way here. I mean, in India, of course, there have been some prison reform movements, and there was a particular IAS officer, she was an IPS officer named Kiran Bedi, who was one of the first female IPS officers who was posted in one of the very high security prisons in India, and she started a prison reform movement with different programs. She got a lot of spiritual people to come teach meditation. They started exercises, they started yoga, and basically upskilling the prisoners so that there's a little industry that works within the prison itself, and they would manufacture different goods, and those goods would be sold outside. But very interesting to see your work and a completely digital take on how potential prison reform movement could be. So towards the end of our conversation, Pia, I'm very curious to know what is next for you and what's in the pipeline for the Smart Prison project. Where do we go from here?
What we are considering at the moment, since we have the system now in one of our units, is that can we extend this model to all our closed prisons in the years coming? Or maybe even next year, could we take another unit into the system? Because that was the idea when we purchased the system, that we will extend it to all our closed units, which are 16 at the moment in Finland. But it will take, of course, some time, and we have to see the system to develop. And we are also piloting prisoner email system during this autumn.
Nice.
And see how it works. And then we are developing our offender management system, and we are trying to bring some use of artificial intelligence in the offender management system. We have interesting projects coming, and developing the overall prison concept also into more rehabilitative and digitalized way. So I'm kind of waiting that this development has just begun. Of course, we've taken some big steps, having the first smart prison in Finland. But this is only the beginning, and then probably we will also see some new digital solutions also on the probation side. So I'm looking forward to what's happening next in the process.
Well, I can't wait to see what you all do there, and I'll be on the lookout. So thank you so much for your time, Pia. This was phenomenal, and you're such a calm and composed speaker, and your thoughts are so articulated. Just really help bring a completely different perspective into the questions that we're looking at this season. So thank you for sharing your work.
Thank you. I hope I was able to clarify our concept and our ideas.
Special thanks to Ayushi Thakur for the research and design support, and Kahan Shah for the background score. You can send in guest suggestions to our Instagram account ArcOffCenter or through our website arcofcenter.com. That is ARCHOFFCENTRE. Thanks for listening.